This is Scandemic Resistance. I'm Thaddeus Kaczynski. This is episode 4. I'm glad to have my interlocutor again, a teacher who will talk to us today. We'll have a conversation about power. Renee, how are you?
Oh, I'm fine, thanks. Oh, I'm actually taking the part in some ways of a student today, right? Um, this is something I'm trying to understand. So hopefully I'll be a helpful interlocutor for the audience in the sense that I'm trying to, unpack what you're saying as well. So,
Yes. Well, I'm going to start out good. Well, we'll see how it goes. We'll have a conversation. This is something that I can't seem to get my mind completely around. Um, what got me thinking was a lecture by Andrew Willard Jones from Franciscan University called The Kingdom of Darkness. It was part of a conference that was held at Franciscan University on the question, is America a tyranny? I will put the lecture, which is on YouTube, in the show notes. I really recommend this to all the listeners, all 5 of them, or however however many there are. Um, and he discusses the issue of sovereignty, and in the paradigm of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan.
mhm.
And it really got me thinking about the question of how do you get it? How do you make truth rule? Um, how do you avoid uh, a culture, a society, political order, all the different aspects um, of a society being ruled by power alone, um, in all its guises. Um, in all its guises, meaning it could be a power that doesn't show itself. It could be a power masking itself under ideology, under slogans. Um, what rules us is freedom. What's ruling us is tolerance. What's ruling us is even love. So I just shared with you a recent advertisement put out by Governor Gavin Newsom of California.
Yeah, gruesome Newsom is what we call him.
Yeah, I'll put a link to this too in the show notes. But it says, something to the effect of, you know, California is a place you can get abortions. Um,
Oh
and
no,
it,
it was need an abortion. California can help, or
Cal-
California is there to help.
California's there to help. Has a picture of a doctor on there.
No, it's a young woman.
Oh, so a young woman there looking desperate, needing help. And then underneath this photo, this photograph and slogan is a scripture.
Hmm.
What's the scripture?
Is love your neighbor as yourself. There's no greater commandment than this. Something, the Mark, it's from one's from Mark, I think.
Yeah. So what's being portrayed there is that love is ruling California. Governor Newsom is ruling us through love, through the love that comes from God, through caritas, commanded by God. We are commanded by God to have abortions or to make them available and legal. This is a commandment of God.
Yeah, there's just there are no words. It's hard to even put words around that when somebody's, it's just, I don't know what it is, just masquerading as love. So
Well,
there's a couple of things you said though that I think might be helpful just to define, if you don't mind. So one of them, I mean, I'm familiar with Hobbes' Leviathan, but a lot of people might not be. So that's, you're saying that is it Willard Jones?
yeah, Andrew Willard Jones. But before
Yeah.
we get into that, though, let me just say, make a little comment on this photo here, because, and then we'll get into this. But what I was saying is this idea of pure power can masquerade itself. In this case, it's masquerading as love. But what it really is, of course, is money. there will be money given to people involved in this murderous industry. And so what's really going on is they're promoting the idea of love, um, and having a law, a freedom based, a right based on love that we can all get under if we're loving people, whether Christian or not. The truth is that I really I'm going to say that Gavin Newsom and these people are lying. They know it's not love. They know it's money, and they want money. And as they get closer and closer to hell, they simply want power, which is what money gives. And so that's what I'm getting at here. It's this raw power, and the idea here is that power is God. Power is God.
Yeah.
Okay, so
But
anyway,
one of the things
yeah,
that comes to my mind that, when you see something like that, an advertisement like that, it makes you feel kind of physically sick. And I think at least it does me. And I feel this kind of twisting inside. And I think part of the reason that it makes me feel sick, and the way that, very obvious Soviet propaganda does not make me feel sick, right? Like I look at it, and there's something similar between those two things, like a Soviet propaganda poster and, this kind of advertisement. And they're both twisted. They're both false. They're both messing with reality. But I think the reason that this one makes me feel really sick inside is because there are a lot of people who will actually buy that,
yeah,
right? Whereas now most people don't buy the Soviet propaganda. And maybe if I were in the Soviet Union, I would see that and feel sick if people were still buying it. But now in this situation, nobody's buying the Soviet one because everybody sort of sees we have an outside view of it, right? We can judge it from some, real reality, real standard outside of it. But in this situation, we're living in California here, we're living sort of shoulder to shoulder with people who will buy that.
yeah,
They'll think that is real. They'll think that makes sense, that it's logical, that it, and they won't see it as, necessarily a power play. They'll see it as, a leader upholding, personal rights. And that's a loving thing to do. And boy, those neighbors out there, those other states who are, not being loving, they're not treating people well. Well, we're going to be your good neighbor. And it's like, oh, it's so gross. But it's the reason it's gross, like I said, is because a lot of people will think that's
yeah.
perfectly fine.
You can't really tyrannize over somebody. You can't simply assert your will over someone and get them to obey it. You can coerce them by fear and force, but you can't get them to choose to obey you if they think that you're simply asserting your personal power over them, um, at their expense. And nobody wants to simply give the good of their life over to someone else just because that person wants it. We still have the natural law. We're still seeking our own good. We still have some kind of self-love in us, no matter how corrupted we are. And so what you have to do is get them to think that somehow by obeying this, they're obeying something good for themselves or for others. Um,
Yeah, so yeah, exactly. So they're using it, you know
that's
but
how you
like,
tyrannize.
yeah, exactly. So Hobbes Leviathan, right? That, and when you're talking about power, maybe just a brief explanation of that, because I think it has to do with this. I mean, Hobbes is pretty bold and blunt, about it, and that's one good thing about Hobbes, similar to Nietzsche, right? Where they're just right out front saying it. They're not pulling any
Right.
punches or doing like a gruesome Newsom move. He's just saying it.
Yeah.
So maybe what, Hobbes's view of sovereignty and power, and what power actually means. That was the second definition I was
Yeah.
going.
Well, so for Hobbes, you don't have society. You don't have people getting along together without killing each other, without civil war, unless the people are afraid of each other to some extent. what each other can do to them. Do we, violence,
Yeah.
especially
So
stealing.
talking about state of nature. Yeah.
Yeah, so people, you know, are see each other as a threat and a competition. That simply can't go on, and no one really wants that kind of society because they know that uh, at one point they might have power, but at another point they won't, and it's just too chaotic. So Hobbes thinks that people just simply don't want that. What they do want is to be able to get what they want and to live their life and amass wealth and power and pleasure and comfort and leisure and all the sort of self-centered, egotistical things we want, which is all Hobbes says we really want, and we live for.
So he would say and I always wondered this about Hobbes. He would say that there is no conception of the natural law that's based on an order of good and goodness and love. He would say that the only natural law he'll accept, or that he has a quote unquote observed, which is impossible, but that he has observed, is, a state of violence and war. Is that right?
Or potential violence and war. It's always waiting to kind of emerge, and it can't be avoided. The only way that's avoided is if the people themselves, this atomized individuals, vector forces of ego, if they are all in thrall to some other power that they do not have competition with. It's all encompassing, all powerful, and everybody knows that if they try to assert their power outside of bounds that this authority allows, then they'll be punished and they won't be able to have what they want. So that's the government, and the government, the Leviathan, he calls it, the mortal god. That institution is of course run by humans, but it's sort of set up in a transcendent manner so that
Right.
anyone who holds the position of power is sort of no longer just a regular citizen. They attain to this exceptional sovereignty, he calls it, and so the
Right.
power is sovereign, which means it's unimpeachable and there's no competition with it, and it's absolute.
And so it's self-justifying.
Yes, and the laws, the customs, even the conceptions of truth and falsity and goodness and evil and reality and unreality, insofar as these are socially accepted, insofar as there's a consensus on these, it determines them.
Right.
It
Okay,
determines
that's the key,
religious truth
right?
as well.
Right,
All,
that's the key.
yeah,
So he's writing in the 1600s,
the
1700s?
early 1600s,
Okay, which is right around, and so
early to mid 1600s during the Civil War of England.
right, and that's only 100 years or so after Henry VIII. It's
Yeah,
only 100 years. It's within the Protestant Reformation and the disintegration of Christendom, which is
yeah,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah. So there's a whole background to this.
Hmm.
Charles the First was executed, I believe, and this was, I think, before the Glorious Revolution that Locke wrote after. It's sort of like between
Yeah.
the established, the, what do you call it, the reestablishment,
Oh, yeah, the
Charles the Second.
yeah,
So
yeah.
anyway, he's seeing
Restoration.
the restoration. So he,
Mhm.
there's a reason why he's writing this, and
Oh, yeah. No, it
he,
makes,
he doesn't like he doesn't like the Puritans getting power, Cromwell. He hates that. So it's sort of a, it's the idea of the state as peacemaking. And if it's the typical view that if everybody gets to define absolute truth and reality for themselves, especially religion, then you have chaos. So we need some other institution. We need like an absolute institution to determine all these things for everybody. Now you're still allowed to believe in what you want, metaphysically, theologically, morally. That's fine, but as an individual, as a private individual, you can. But in terms of institution, social, cultural, the truth of society, what society accepts as true and good and
yeah,
right, that's determined by the Leviathan.
right.
And
Okay.
we simply, it's not even a matter of it being true. It's just what is the case for society. And so, I mean, you kind of see this, right? Like an example would be like a politically correct viewpoint about something that gets enforced, you're not allowed not to believe in it. It simply has power, and it's simply the truth. But if you question it being true, you're showing that you're a bad citizen and you're subversive. So you get punished. I mean, it's like that. It's not up for debate. It's not and so it plays the role of a sacred kind of almost like a god. And it is this Leviathan is a god. It has all power. It's sovereign.
Right. Okay. So your definition of power, getting really simple here, is it just the ability? I mean, in a Hobbesian view, and this world of sovereignty, the state as being sovereign, self-justifying, is the purveyor of reality, basically.
Yeah.
Um, then for a public reality, we'll call it that. So
Yeah.
then power, you're saying, is just the ability to do that, or is it the ability to get what you want, or what would you say is?
Well, I mean, individuals, they have some power. They have the power to amass wealth and to pursue different lifestyles and pleasures. So I mean, power is in a way media is dispersed, distributed, but it is in effect the ability to execute your will. Okay, and when it comes to power in public, social power, legal power, cultural, religious power, to determine what people do, what rights they have, and what they have to do, and the punishments and involved in breaking them, and to determine what's considered to be the official truth for the regime, the official. So you might say, like, somebody like in the tradition of Nietzsche and Foucault will say, truth is nothing but the utterances of the powerful. Well, yeah, that's true in Hobbes, but the powerful is only the state, and whoever happens to be in that position, in the different administrative and bureaucratic
Mhm.
or monarchic. I mean, it doesn't have to be just a monarchy; it could be a
Right.
bureaucracy. Um, I mean, it's sort of like when you go to the DMV, there's no debate with the clerk about like what forms have to be filled. There isn't like, you don't have Socratic questioning about it. It just, you must do this or you can't drive.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what the regulation is. It could be as crazy as it is in California or common sense as it is in Wyoming. But that bureaucracy does have, absolute power in that little sphere, right? So that's like a little microcosm of this.
Mhm.
It's not even about what's good. It's not about the good of driving or the good of like, needing to have your car registered for the sake of whatever it is they have all these regulations for. The conception, the idea that the bureaucracy is ordered to a good that we all share in and can know, that's gone. It's just the bureaucrat at the DMV, and he gets his orders from somewhere else and wherever the buck stops. But at some point, you have this just complete arbitrary assertion of power, and there's no check, there's no redress, there's no debate, there's no deliberation, there's no consensus involved, and it doesn't have to do with reality.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, and that's why everybody jokes about the DMV. It's like going to hell. And I think that, when I was in the Soviet Union really briefly at the end, the whole society was like that. That was the whole society was a closed society, and not just closed borders, but closed minds and
Yes.
a closed system, so that whoever was in a position of authority, was basically determining, and that's determining reality for everybody else. And that was it was interesting because that filtered down into the equivalent of the DMV person, like the person at the grocery store and the person at the they all operated that way.
Right, and it gets pervasive. So that's just a little microcosm. But here's a contemporary example, another one.
Yeah.
So a typical person who is uprooted from reality, from true religion, the Tao, the natural law, from
Hmm.
good, wholesome communal and family life, good education. Just imagine a character, a perfect citizen sovereign totalitarian regime, right?
Mm-hmm.
This person is basically psychologically, emotionally disturbed, underdeveloped, vicious. Basically just the soul has been poisoned, and the body probably. So this person will be told that if they feel that they should have a different gender, they have the right to have a surgeon execute an operation which will give them the power to be the gender they think they are, and they will feel that they should do that if they have an inkling. If they don't, they don't have to, but they will feel that that's their right, and they will be celebrated in doing it, and they'll be facilitated in doing it, and they'll actually become a kind of member of a protected class, because once they've done this, if you criticize them for anything, they'll be able to say that it's some kind of prejudice, and they can get away with whatever they want to say or do. So there's a lot of benefits to this. On the other hand, they will also be told they have no choice but to take an injection from that same medical establishment because they're telling you to, and they will happily take that injection, and they might die from it. They might get sick from it. They also could die and get sick from the operation. Their soul is getting sick. And in any event, what's happening to them is they are not acting from within the realm of what's good, of thinking what's good, of any kind of sense of what human nature is and what it's for what their purpose in life is. And they're not acting towards a conception of happiness that's objective, that has to do with reality, all that.
Okay, wait. So what you're
Hold
doing
on.
is, wait, you set up what I think you did was you set up two extremes. One is the extreme individualism, right?
Yeah,
Where I want this, and the government or the society perhaps gives you the right to do that without any reference to what's good. And
yeah.
then on the other extreme is the state coming in and coercing you in terms of your health, your
Yes.
medical health.
What's
And
the common denominator?
yeah, the common denominator is that there's no reference to what's actually good.
It's pure power.
Okay.
So what you have is power is God.
So are you saying that you have Hobbes' Leviathan, which is your more extreme example of that state power and sovereignty, self-justifying, one who arbitrates reality. But then in the modern liberal democracies, you have in a sense, the opposite extreme.
Well, the Hobbes is the modern liberal democracy.
Okay, wait though, because the Hobbes is like the Hobbes is very authoritarian, but
Oh yeah,
how
exactly.
does no, I know, but how does your example of the individual, saying, I feel like I'm transgender, so I'm gonna go through all of this therapy, and everyone says, oh, sure, that's fine, that's your right, you can, make up reality as you see fit because you're an
Yeah,
individual. So
that's
Hobbes would not see that and say that's okay,
yes,
right?
you would.
Oh, you would? Okay.
Remember the world outs. Look, it's liberalism, secular libertarian liberalism is Hobbesian. It is not. Hobbesianism does not mean that there's this authoritative rule, and so in your public and private life, and you never have the ability to do what you want.
Okay.
No, you have the right to do what you want as authorized by the state. And in your private life, it means the right to be free from the good and the true and any tradition or culture or inheritance or any non-state strictures, family custom, social custom, religious custom, custom and norms that are not determined by the state. Those you're free from, and the state liberates you from those.
So it's that what Schindler talks about, the freedom from rather than the freedom.
Yes, everything's an option, and anything that's not an option that you're coerced mentally, emotionally into doing, the state's going to free you from. So now you have people, mutilating themselves as an act of freedom. But what I'm getting at here is, in the end, what it is pure power. Okay, so this person is worshiping power, and they're being cultivated in that worship because the state does the same. Power is God. Now, here's the irony of all this: that if tomorrow somebody gets in control of the state and determines that everyone, let's see, what would be the opposite of this? Determines that you're not permitted to, I don't know, to kiss the opposite sex, unless the state, tells you you're married. I don't. Who knows? I'm just saying, like something like ridiculously puritanical.
Hmm.
It would be the same thing. The people would obey it as long as the state were doing that, not from a conception of the good, just from pure power. In other words, it's completely arbitrary what people are, permitted to do and what they want to do, even.
Right. And this, I would say, in a modern democracy, that sort of what's permitted or who's in power is at least seen as this kind of, amorphous or vague will of the people, right? And so it's they kind of think, well, as long as we have, the will of the people, well, then aren't you, coming from a common, the common, I don't know, common conception of the good, right? Like everybody's sort of
Oh,
coming together and
it,
saying,
it,
hey,
it, it, it,
we're
it,
gonna have wait, hang on a second. We're gonna have this, this leader, and like people who want to have Trump come back or whatever. They're like, well, that's what we want because that's what it means. That's what's good for America, right? That's what's so people will use this language. But what you're saying is that actually we don't live in a paradigm where when you call it the good that it actually is something outside that has real authority over
no,
what we're doing.
it's either the will of an external group, um, over you, or it's your own will. Okay, like it's just will, but whether it's your will or someone else's, okay, it has nothing to do with what's good or real. So it's either the tyranny of your own will, the tyranny of another's, and they really come to the same thing.
And is that what Nietzsche was seeing? Nietzsche, I should say.
Well, yeah, I think he saw that that's what reality is. It's simply power. It's the will. And so your job is to assert your will and to be the kind of person who can assert it with efficacy and without any deference to something other than the will. Yeah, will was God for Nietzsche, as it was for Hobbes, and as it is for most people today, because they've been habituated into this through living under a regime that says it's promoting freedom and democracy and all these moral terms like equality and inclusiveness and prosperity. But in the end, it's becoming more and more apparent that it's pure will, and the most egregious and tragic and unspeakable example of this is the scandemic. Because in the scandemic, you have the medical establishment, which is obviously almost like the purest, most obvious example of something that shouldn't be based on pure power. Okay, if there's any good that all of us can agree on, it's health. Okay, we all want to be healthy, and we all sort of have, it's like a no-brainer. When you're sick, you want to be healthy, so you go to the hospital, which helps you to be healthy because it actually promotes the good of health. Okay, well, the truth is, in a very short time, we had these institutions behaving as leviathans, promoting pure power under the guise of health, actually killing people for power and money. And I would say money on the one hand, because they were being paid to do it, but also just for the power of the totalitarian regime that was emerging.
And what you're talking about when you say they were, killing people is when they're using, the protocols given them by the CDC, by the health departments, and they're being paid, I don't
Yeah,
know, a few tens thousands of dollars to call something a COVID death or say they had a COVID patient. So there was monetary incentive. But there are also these protocols, and there's these tragic stories from these very good doctors who really do understand a conception of the good, who were simply trying to use repurposed medications
Yeah,
like ivermectin
of
and
course.
stuff, and they were told that they couldn't use that. They had to use what they were being told by the hospital, and they had to stand there and watch patients die because they were being given remdesivir or ventilators.
So let me
And
let
so it was like not somebody coming out in a hospital and saying, you know, I want to kill people, but it's that they are within a system that is so built on this idea of, you know, being beholden and captured by pharmaceutical industries, which are out for profit,
look.
and our health departments and the whole system is sort of set up on this idea. We're all starting to realize that it's all set up on this premise that you know, it's about power and money, and people in power have a lot of influence over medical boards, over hospitals, over
It's not
schools.
it's not just your
Yeah,
basic wickedness. It's a whole nother level of evil. Okay, because
yeah,
this is what you. So let's use your example. You have doctors who are within this Leviathan institution. I want to call the hospital a kind of mini Leviathan now. Okay, in other words, a Leviathan institution is one in which the the claims that are made about any kind of subject matter, justice
mhm,
or health, and the assertions and claims, the laws and the protocols and the commands have nothing to do other than power. Okay,
mhm.
they're not ordered to a good or the truth, because if they were, it wouldn't be sovereign. It would have something higher than itself, something it would have to defer to, right?
Yeah, and you get these examples, many examples of people. I can't remember her name, but somebody who was a PA, a physician's assistant, who was seeing people coming in the emergency room with all kinds of vaccine injuries and problems, and she was starting to report to VAERS, the passive, you know, reporting system in our country for vaccine adverse events. And so she's reporting this and she's filling out dozens of them. And every doctor is supposed to fill one out if something comes in that's suspicious. So she's doing it. Nobody else wants to do it because they're afraid. And then she has on tape this conversation she has with the hospital administration where they're basically telling her, you know, to stop doing what she's legally required to
Right.
do. And she's doing it because she has a conception of the good, because
Yeah.
this is what's right. But
Yes.
she keeps saying that to them in this conversation, and this woman who's running the hospital or whatever her position is, she keeps coming back and saying, "Well, you know, yeah, but we really can't talk about that. You need to
Right.
stop talking
Exactly.
about that."
Talk about that or authorize any use of power based
Right?
on any conception of the good. Okay. So look,
Yeah.
if you have if okay if so what you have here is you have an institution um, that has become Leviathan, meaning that that there are people involved that are still trying to do something based on what they call health, based on something they consider good, and you have the institutional authority saying, "Look, you, the state, we're a kind of like our adjunct of the state. Okay, we're public. Okay, so we are not. We when you accept the reality of the Leviathan, you recognize that only power can authorize actions. And so, if your actions are authorized by the good of these patients, then it has to be that we have to give you a protocol that is not that. Okay, and it sounds insane, but as long as people have been accepting this for so long that the state can't have a conception of the good. Okay, what that amounts to is it has to actually be deliberately functioning to go against the actual good and the real. And that's what you had. You had hospitals murdering patients by giving them poison, remdesivir, not doing it out of some psychopathic desire to kill, like, oh, I want to kill people, because that wouldn't be Leviathan. It's simply the case that, empty, um, you know, morally empty and good empty, you might say, power was taking over. Okay, and that's because power is God.
Well, it's
So,
like you were saying the other day when you know, Anthony Fauci says, I am the science. You know, like if you disagree with me, you disagree with the science. You know, it's like that is a really good example of a really prominent authority using this kind of logic because and living within this paradigm because of course, you know, nobody who's any real scientist would ever say that because it's
sure.
the, you know, the true and good nature of the scientific enterprise is to always be open to argument, always be open to falsification, to know what you don't know, and to be somebody who steps aside for, you know, the truth to come out. And so all of a sudden you have this person who's speaking about science but is actually speaking as a leviathan about science, and so shutting it down, basically destroying it, changing it.
Look, the minute you enter into a realm that's outside of your basement watching the internet, in other words, you're entering into the public realm, and let's say you have a public duty that gives you authority and privilege, like a doctor, okay?
Yeah.
You are now under different rules, okay? You are under the rule of the Leviathan, the rule of the state, which is to say, you have to act according to no conception of the good, definitely not your own. You have to act according to the conception of what you must do that is given to you by the official authorities. Okay, now in a normal non-satanic, non-totalitarian regime, the directives that you're being given would have to do with the actual good of the people that are under you in terms of this would be health and your patients. And
Well, okay, yes, and I think
hold on,
yeah.
and that good
Mm.
would be based on what's actually true and real about health. Okay, but remember, what's actually good and true and real about anything cannot be above the will of the sovereign. The sovereign has to determine these things. Okay, and so that
Well, I
means,
see what I'm saying is I think over the last couple of years what's happened is that, I mean, you're saying that this sort of idea of sovereignty and the leviathanism, and I would say the Lockean social contract is very similar to that. But I think that you're saying this starts way back, you know, in the maybe during the disintegration of the Middle Ages. This idea of separating these institutions and separating, you know, maybe it's the rise of the nation state, right? Separating that out and saying we can create our own conception of the good, and we have the right to, you know, translate reality to our people. But it's interesting because I feel like what's happened in the last couple of years is that, you know, that sort of sovereignty was kind of happening maybe, you know, in the upper levels, or, you know, happening kind of in bureaucracies, like, but I feel like on the ground level there's always been this modicum of common sense, you know, where people kind of, they talk to their doctors, or they you know, figure things out, and they're actually living as if there's a natural law, as if there's a good that is, you know, outside of
like
things,
the, that's
outside
like
of everything.
that's like the lady at the DMV who realizes you're in a situation where it doesn't really work what the
Yeah.
protocol, and then she kind of goes against the protocol to help you. That would happen at Wyoming, less in California.
Yeah, yeah. So you, I mean, Wyoming's a good example of that, right? Where you have people that, you know, you have to deal with nature all the time. I mean, like raw nature, and it seemed to me that it produced a kind of people who were very realistic in the
Yeah,
sense that they, you know, cowboy ethics were basically almost like natural law
yeah.
rules in a way. And so I feel like over the last couple of years what's happened is that the Leviathan, which was maybe working for decades, you know, in this country, at least decades, maybe longer, as a kind of slow takeover of government, of the military industrial complex, of, you know, pharmaceuticals. I mean, this is vaccine stuff and military industrial stuff has been going on, corruption. It's been going on for a long time. But I feel like in the last couple of years, what happened is that all of a sudden there was this reach down into, the kinds of institutions that we all um, are in need of at some points. It was going to reach down into everybody's lives, and that's the best way to do that is through health. If you're going to do that, and then all of a sudden people are starting to lose their common sense, right? They're starting to follow lockstep things and measures and mandates like masks and experimental vaccines that were never tested properly. You know, people are just kind of walking lockstep with it. All of a sudden, it's like everybody lost that connection with their own God-given,
Yes,
connection
exactly what
to what's
happened.
actually good.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. So normally, I mean, you had this pure power ideology working in the background, but usually, like, you see this in the public schools. Public schools have such nonsense in terms of their protocols and curriculum. It's all ideological. It has nothing to do with the good of souls or real learning, right? People have seen this for 100 years,
Yeah,
but in the typical school, which is in a neighborhood, which has people who know each other,
yeah,
they still act like neighbors, and they still do common sense things for the
yeah,
students.
yeah,
And okay, but then what happened? You had students wearing masks for 8 hours a day,
yeah,
and these same people, um, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them turned into pure power worshiping bureaucrats, you might say, and hardly any of them stepped in to rescue these kids. And you had the nurses and doctors, and you had the
yeah.
school board members, and then I mean, and now you have people literally dropping dead from a poison injection, and it's like, nope, this has to be okay because the power told us. And I'm not sure. Um, what the solution is at this point, other than to see what I've been doing for a long time in my work, is to unmask any kind of articulation of a conception of political order which doesn't base it in what's real, both natural and supernatural.
Hmm.
And ultimately, that means that the buck stops not at the sovereign power arbitrarily designated, but it stops at the church, okay? Because the church is the mystical body of Christ. Christ is the God man. The only person with sovereign power is God and the God man, who are one. He does have sovereign power because he is his own authority, because he
And when
is
you
the
say,
good.
yeah, so again, just reminding, when you say sovereignty or sovereign power, it's a kind of power that justifies itself. It's justified
Yes, it's
itself.
that's right. Self-justifying power, nothing
Yeah.
outside of it. It defers to nothing but itself. Only God defers to nothing but himself, because he is in himself a trinity of relationships of love. He is truth, he is reality itself. That's what sovereignty comes from. It is God. Um, and whenever there's something else that counterfeits this, that tries to take a place of it, you're dealing with the Antichrist and the totalitarianism. So you can't have a Christian sovereign. You can't have a Catholic confessional state if that means the power of the state is sovereign. You have to have something else.
Well, yeah, I
So,
mean, I was thinking of different conceptions of what might be a proper order. And we were, you and I were talking earlier, we were trying to figure out, was it somewhere in the Middle Ages? And I was recommending a book called Women in the Days of the Cathedrals by Regine Pernon. She's a French historian and wonderful historian. And she seems to give a picture between about 700 to about the late 1200s, early 1300s AD in Western Europe, where it seemed to me that there was something going on there that seemed more like what would be a society that has different levels of authority and hierarchical structures, but those structures are all seen by everybody as subject to a transcendent um, conception of the good. And C.S. Lewis talks a lot about the way medievals saw the world. Also Owen Barfield talks about that and saving the appearances. And they're getting at this idea that medievals had models, they had paradigms or structures, the way we do, right? We have a paradigm or structure, and you're saying that Hobbesian Leviathan is a kind of modern paradigm or structure that we're all living in. But the difference is that in the medieval period, they knew the model was a model, and they knew that there was something outside of it, and that they were always bound to look for, seek, judge their own structures and models of authority against real good, real authority, real truth, goodness, and beauty. And I don't know, I'm
Yeah.
not a medieval scholar, but one of the modern versions of this, actually, where the poetics can be so helpful, is actually, I think you'll see it in the Lord of the Rings. You'll see that kind of pre-modern idea of, a king, and different people with different authority, but they're all looking towards or subject to, in a way, this concept of the good, what is over them, what is beyond them.
Right.
The idea, that's he includes the idea of Numenor, and the lands that the elves are always returning to. And so that kind of mystical sort of land or
Yeah.
authority structure outside Middle Earth is always what's being referenced.
Right. And I mean, it's really hard to imagine what this could look like because we haven't really experienced it.
Yeah,
We have experienced it insofar as we're connected to God and the church and the natural law and good families and good institutions that are still, in spite of this Hobbesian infection, cancer, are still pointing to something outside themselves. You experience it when you read Plato's Republic. I mean, what
right.
Plato is trying to say is this: that what you need is, I mean, his famous quote is, we'll never have justice unless the rulers become philosophers, philosophers become the rulers. What he means by this is the person or group of people who are in intimacy and union with the good are therefore given authority over the regime and the society, not because they're sovereigns, but because they do nothing else but communicate and mediate between the good and the society. Okay, and they are privileged, and for whatever reason, they have access to this. They've worked for it. They've been educated for it. They love it. Now, the problem with Plato is that that access only comes to us from above through Christ. So, in my opinion, Plato was really searching for this, reaching out
Yeah,
for a kind of incarnation.
yeah.
Um, and so, when God becomes man, that access is given. Now we have the true authority on earth, not just in the transcendent realm, but in the immanent realm. And the church is is that continuation of space and time of that connection with the good.
Okay, so
Okay.
let me just bring something in here. My parents are I come from a Protestant background, and my dad's an interesting guy because he says, I mean, he is, I think you're quintessential Protestant in the sense, because he'll always tell me that, I like some of the things I see in the Catholic Church, he'll say, but I don't, it's a human institution, and so he'll say, and no human institution can claim to have a kind of infallibility about the truth. So in the one hand, there's something good about him in the sense that he doesn't trust, or he says he doesn't trust these, human institutions, right? He knows that
They're not.
they can't, that they're not sovereign, right? In the sense, he knows that about schools, he knows that about governments, he knows that. But the problem is that, you can look back in the Protestant era, and the church obviously was failing in certain ways, or the world was changing, and people lost faith. Many people lost faith in this idea that there could be an institution that was both divine and had a human hierarchy. and they just lost faith in it. And so all of a sudden, you have this breakdown of, between human institution, any human institution, including churches or the church, and and the ultimate connection to God and to the conception of the real. And so you have this splintering effect that happens, and then what do you look to? How do you know what's good?
Yeah.
So you can kind of see how this happened. Sort of, I can kind of see how people might have ended up, in this mode where it's like there's no connection to the good. There's no real connection. And so what are we left with? We have to make up these institutions that sort of take the place of that, like Hobbes' Leviathan. But
Yeah.
then the problem is that what you're saying and what you've always talked about is that it then that's sort of like, well, we're just going to have these structures that sort of like run things in a utilitarian way, like Kavanaugh's, utility company.
Yeah.
And then we're just going to like let them run things, but we'll have our own conceptions of the good. And that works in a way, but not really. It doesn't really work long term. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
No, it doesn't, because everyone acts regardless of their intentions or conscious deference to the good. They're either the
Yeah.
apparent good or the actual good, and that includes anyone at all times, including people who are bureaucrats. Um,
Yeah.
okay, and so there's no way out. Um, and everyone has some power, and everyone exerts power, some more than others.
Mm.
And whatever position you're in, when you're acting, there's a conception of the good, and it's impossible to be neutral. That goes for politics. So that unmasks liberalism as a complete counterfeit and lie. Okay, so getting back to the original thing, what if that's the true, and it is true, and a lot of people are waking up to the lie of liberalism, thanks to the
Mhm.
work of New Polity, Andrew Willard Jones, before him, D.C. Schindler, before him, his father, David Schindler, before the Schindlers, the John Rao and Jeff Bond, and before them, Leo the 13th, and on and on and on. You know, so, and there's other radical orthodoxy. I mean, the last 10 years have seen a kind of dismantling of the
Yeah.
liberal lie, and as that's being dismantled, then we have the ultimate manifestation of pure power that really should be giving the lie to liberalism, which is the scandemic. And that's why I look at it as a kind of revelation. God saying, look, I want you to see what it is, what it looks like when you dare pretend and try to act like that I'm not real. Okay, that I'm a private option. God's saying, I'm just a conception of the good. I'm one among many options. Okay, it's the ultimate insult. Okay, it's better to say no
Yeah.
to God and hate him than to have this kind of mealy mouthed, lukewarmness. Okay, and God says, okay, you want to pretend you can have an order that's based on just multiplying conceptions of the good, and everybody gets their preferences. You think you're better than the Middle Ages? You would never have had this mass murder, systematic, coordinated mass murder of people, with everyone wearing filthy diapers on their faces. The Middle Ages would never have tolerated this. You're not better, you're worse. So it's a revelation of the truth. Okay,
Mhm.
now that we're here and liberalism has been unmasked, okay, one thing we don't want to do is replace the psychos and narcissists and asses that are in control of this leviathan state with good Catholics. Let's just replace them with conservatives and Catholics who know the moral law, who love God. Okay, there's something really wrong here with that, because what you're dealing with is the problem of sovereign power. And if you put into that sovereign power structure someone who loves good and true and knows it, but they still have to act in this structure, it's gonna backfire, because again, no one, no one's gonna have access to this truth or good in public anyway. And so, well, it doesn't matter because they have it, and they know what's good, and what they say is right, and we just have to obey it because they're good people. Okay, that sounds familiar. That's precisely the problem, right? That's what happened. We had the
Mm.
divine right of kings and the confessional states. That was the beginning of the Hobbesian, infestation. So we can't have sovereign power at all. Now, what does that mean? We have to have a state. We have to have political order. I don't know. I mean,
Well, you're
just
just saying what you're saying is we can't have a society that has this conception of the their nation state or the state itself as being a just self-justifying
yes, yes,
arbiter of the good. So, I
right.
mean, I always look back to that Supreme Court decision. I can't remember what the name of it was, but where they basically, one of the justices said, well, we're ruling that that people in this land have the right to their own conception of the good,
Yes,
basically.
Planned Parenthood versus Casey,
Right. And
95.
right. Okay, yeah, that was it. And so that judge was a major authority, a part of the state, giving citizens permission to have their own conception of
Yeah,
the good. It's
the
like,
word power.
wait,
He was
who
authorized
gave yeah, who
power.
gave you that power
Right.
to do
That
that? It's so
Anthony Kennedy, a Catholic.
Yeah, it's
Another,
so crazy. But
yeah,
I guess what I'm saying is that, okay, so it has to be that when you're talking about Catholic integralism, or you're talking about, people thinking that we just have to, fix it from within or something. And you're basically saying, no, the being within this conception of power, as as a sovereignty of a state instead of the sovereignty of God, um, is that's the part of the problem, that you can't stay within it.
that's Carl Schmitt was a notorious Catholic philosopher during Hitler's reign, and he's considered a good guy by some right wing people because he wanted to have like Catholicism and right wing conservative ideas be like in charge. But again, he was also saying that the person in authority has the right to make exceptions to all the different rights that are given to people. He was a good example of what I'm talking about. You cannot have a Catholic Leviathan. Okay, here's a good example of.
Okay, wait,
Wait, wait, wait.
go ahead. Yeah.
I want a good example of a Catholic Leviathan right now is Jorge Bergoglio, otherwise known as Pope Francis. He is acting as a sovereign in the Vatican. Okay, and
Well,
it's like,
that's what I was going to bring up,
and
is this idea.
we can't fix that by getting a good guy in there who's acting the same way. We have a papacy now that is arbitrarily asserting and claiming and acting, and in many ways in coordination with the New World Order Leviathan, with
Okay,
the
wait,
injections.
let's rewind, because this is going to be really controversial for some people if they don't understand it. I mean, it is controversial, but it's really important to understand it. So you said before, and I was talking about my dad, with his mistake about the church, was that he looked at that and said, well, like, Protestants in the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s were losing faith in centralized religion or a church, one church claiming to be, in a sense, a kind of having a certain sovereignty, right? Because it had a claim to, the Holy Spirit, to infallibility, right? So, as a lot of Catholics will say, well, the Catholic understanding is going to give people, who are in office, even in Leviathan states, those people, by virtue of being Catholic, are going to, have a line to the good, right? And you're saying, no, that doesn't work. And then but now you've got the most ultimately confusing thing, which is that you have the person, right, the only person in the world who does, by Catholic definition, have this infallibility in very
Yeah,
certain cases,
there's
right?
no power that is over him.
Yeah, exactly. So, um, wait a minute. So when Pope Francis is saying things and asserting things, I'm sure there's I mean, this is the most confusing thing,
It is.
because he's in the place where the only office, human office in the world that really truly does have, at times, at very, very specific times, has this actual, connection to real sovereignty, right?
When he's speaking ex cathedra,
Exactly. When he's speaking ex cathedra. So
it is,
you've got somebody in that position who you're saying is simultaneously acting as his own conception of the good.
well, because the Pope's job, okay, the Pope is sovereign when he's making, okay, this is a tricky issue
It is.
because you might say, like, everybody wants something where the buck stops. So
I know.
The Protestants say it's scripture, right? Well, we
Yeah.
know that what happens is that it can't be scripture because scripture is not self-interpreting, and it's not meant to be a sovereign authority because it's a book. Okay, so then it has to be the tradition of that book. It has a wider context, but then that wider
Hmm.
context is a community, and that community is one with authority structure, and so you end up with the church. So we end up knowing that the authority of the Bible itself is the church. The church's tradition, one of those infallible artifacts of its tradition is written tradition, which is scripture. Another is oral tradition. And then you have this even higher authority, you might say, the magisterium, which is paradoxically under the scriptures. It can't go against them, and it can't go against its own oral traditions, but it has a power given by the Holy Spirit to never err when it's teaching authoritatively. Okay,
Hmm.
so you have this system of sovereignty, you might say, in terms of truth, um, and that really is the only one because again, Christ was sovereign. He gave that sovereignty to humans who don't have it in themselves, but they only have it when they are deferring to Christ, and that means to prior decisions and traditions that have developed organically, and so even a pope can only exercise his authority when it's in accordance with tradition. And there's a sense in which he determines that, but it's also the fact that that tradition is authoritative to him. So it's very paradoxical. And so you're right. If you have a pope who is seeing himself as his own man, I mean, that's why they say you can't have a heretic as a pope, or if a pope becomes a heretic, he loses the office and all that. But then the problem becomes who determines if he's a heretic. So that's why you have this issue, this crisis right now in the church. But the reason, to me, this pope is so much acting in accordance with this false counterfeit notion of sovereignty is because he is an agent of this Leviathan, this evil counterfeit, and he's an agent of that counterfeit from within the church, um, and at worst, he wants to turn the church into just another Leviathan arbitrary power structure. And of course, if that's what the church is, it's weak, and then it will simply defer to the Antichrist, who's the ultimate example of pure power. So we have the setup for the Antichrist with this person in the Vatican. Um, and there's so many Catholics who can't see this, and because they've been colonized by the sovereign.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's been very difficult too, though, because, and I understand why they're trying to hang on and why they've been trying to hang on, because it's a very uh, difficult and controversial and complex, confusing thing to try to unpack,
Well, here's a good.
but I think this,
Yeah,
this recent thing that
yeah.
he said, and I can't even say the name of the, was an apostolic letter, so it's not an infallible document, but it has, I mean, normally these things would have, you carry with them the demand for respect, and the demand
Well,
to,
it's more
yeah.
than a remark on a plane. Okay,
No, it's more than a mark on a plane. I don't know if it's more, is it more than or less than an encyclical?
it's less, I
Okay,
think.
so it's less than an encyclical, it's an apostolic letter, but it still has this sort of official
Yeah,
kind of, and a lot of people might mistake that as like, oh, we need to just accept this. But what's going to happen, saying things like, "Oh, all you need for the reception of communion is faith." It was said within this context of, basically, I don't know, just eschewing this whole tradition and what the Council of Trent talked
Well,
about. It's
obviously
just,
that departs from the traditional infallible teaching. It's just
oh, it does, yeah, and you've got, more and more, mainstream bishops and people coming on board saying this is not right. You no longer have just five cardinals. You've
no,
got a number of
I just
people.
I just signed the letter. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah, so Bishop Strickland is on there.
look, so I think
Yeah.
in the end here we have this conundrum of once you like this is what the position I'm in is I've spent a lot of years trying to unmask these counterfeits that simply take the place of truth, reality, goodness, ordering things. And it all started in Plato. Plato's the one who said this. The good has to order everything, the real. And then David Schindler, DC Schindler, has written the best, most definitive book on this, Politics of the Real. So it's been said. We know the truth. It's out there. Um,
Yeah.
okay, but how do you not fall into the trap of the sovereignty problem? Because, like, if you want truth to rule, um you want like so the first step is we know that the truth has to rule. It always does. The good, let's say the good and the true, let's just call it that. There's no option outside of the good and the true ruling. This is what the post-liberal Catholics have recognized now in New Polity magazine, the Schindlers. We're done with liberalism. Okay, we know we're in the era now where some sort of integralism is seen as inevitable. So, like David Schindler, the elder, said, his famous quote is, um, "There is not just something like there is freedom from and freedom for." Freedom from is ordered to freedom for, and every kind of freedom for implies a theology.
Hmm.
So, in other words, you can't escape some sort of ultimate uh, truth claim, kind of being at the sovereign level of things in society. No more neutrality. No more. We're going to promote freedom as the good. That's nonsense. Okay, there's some kind of determinate conception. So either God rules or it's some other counterfeit. Either the church is in charge in some sense, in an authoritative position in a society, politics, and culture, or it's some counter church. Now we know this, okay?
Yeah.
So now the question is, how do you get, how do you arrange it? What do you do to act, for the end of the truth and the good and reality being in charge? What does that even look like now in this regime, in this kind
I
of
mean,
regime?
I know maybe you have to go back to Plato. Maybe you have to go back to, some of the medieval thinkers, where I mean, Plato, what does he say? It's the cave, right? We're all in the cave in a sense, like the shadows on the wall and the puppeteers. Those are people who think that they have sovereignty, right? That they can tell other people and chain other people to their own conception of the
Yeah,
good. And those people are chained to that because they don't know that there's anything else. And they think that there's nothing there's that those people have sovereignty, right? The puppeteers have sovereignty. So Plato's, response to that is you have to go outside. Well, how do you get outside? The only way you get outside is if somebody comes and unchains you and walks you out.
yeah,
And then and he does, it's so brilliant because he talks about this, when you're going to go back in and try to pull people out of the cave, out of this false, paradigm of sovereignty, then they're not going to want to go, right? They're going to be reluctant. And, I mean, look what happened to Socrates, right?
yeah,
It's basically it's trying to rescue people, but then what is outside the cave? Like,
yeah.
what's outside there? We can't. I don't know. It's hard to understand what he's talking about philosophy, right? He's talking about a sight, true, true sight, seeing things by the light or looking directly at the light. Um,
Well, look, the
uh,
most that these counterfeits can do is to prevent each individual person from living the truth and the good in an integrated, holistic way. It can't really stop you from believing in something and acting on it, but it can make it so that you limit the sphere of that. So liberalism got a lot of Christians and Catholics living a schizophrenic, compartmentalized existence where they
yeah,
tried to live the gospel in their family and their community, but when they went to work, whether it was a business or in politics or whatever it was, they ended up following power, and they tried to like reconcile this together, and it just caused chaos, and it caused them to be less saintly. I mean, that's what liberalism does. That's what all ideologies do. So the solution then is just you know wherever anybody is in their personal life right now, to kind of recognize that they have to be as much as they can at every moment, under the truth, in reality, and doing the good. There's no place where that doesn't exist. God reigns in everything. There's no area of American life where you can't do that. You have to do it everywhere, and you have to do it at all times. um and
well,
there's
I
no
think,
you know
like what's the, like what does that look like in fleshed,
yeah, good question.
not in the abstract. And I remember I was, long, long time ago, I was in South Africa, and maybe I've told you this story, but I was in South Africa, and that was another kind of Leviathan, in the sense where you had this whole society that was built on something that was just really bizarre. And the idea of apartheid was really the sort of the philosophy and ideology and the culture behind it was really bizarre. And so I remember we were trying to talk to different people who were living in that reality, and it really was like talking to people who were kind of like in a cult or in an alternate reality where they couldn't hear you, or they couldn't see outside of it. And and it seemed like impossible. I remember thinking that this is impossible. You can't, how do you talk to people? How do you? And I remember this guy saying to me, who lived there and really suffered there a lot. And he said, it's really simple. He said, you're not going to change this by trying to change the system. You're not going to change it by changing a system, right? You can't, and you can't get within it and try to change it from without, from within, right? He was saying you can't do that. He said, what you have to do is you have to get to know individual people one at a time, and you have to get at their hearts, get at what they, and it sounds really pat and silly, but when you watch somebody actually doing that, somebody who, I mean, and Socrates does it. They said, what are you doing, Socrates? What do you do all day? Socrates, you moron. And he says, I just walk around the agora, I walk around the marketplace, and I speak to whoever will listen.
Yeah.
I listen to whoever has questions, or whoever is wants to get into an argument. And that's exactly what he did, was to just go around and relate to people and talk to people. And I think in some ways, this one of the most important lessons, I think, for people over the last couple of years is just what happens to people when that ability just to relate to other human beings in a normal way, when they don't look like, horses or ducks, with masks on. You can actually see them and relate to them and know them, that people saw how important that was, how fundamental it is. And I
Yeah.
think it's because it's that those moment by moment interactions, going out into nature, just seeing the world, and kind of relating to people and their normal, lives of sufferings and joys, and all of that, like that is the ground up. That's where you have to start. And it sounds really, really simplistic, but I mean, it's where St. Francis started, you know, it really is. He just went out into nature and he just met what was coming down the road towards him. And
That's
he
great.
just was Christ for
Yeah.
that person in that moment, or that animal or that tree or whatever he was dealing with. He was you know, a second Christ in that moment for those people, because he was so
Yeah.
deeply connected to God.
Well, that's good. That's really good. I agree. That's well said. I agree. The only issue I have with that is to try to, when you're doing that, um, there's already in these people a sense in which what they're talking about with you in the non-public realm of the private is not true. Like it might be a nice value, might be attractive, but they've been told so many ways, brainwashed
Hmm.
into not thinking that that conversation you're having is
I know.
anything other than an idiosyncratic, amusing, personally satisfying thing. For them to see that what you've just discovered is reality, and that reality is relevant everywhere, including the political, the legal, and it's true
Mm.
for everyone, not just for you two in that conversation. Like that's the difficult thing
It
is
is. And
to wake them up to that.
exactly. I think when you're dealing, that's one of the problems with dealing, you know, we'll talk about logic, right? There's the, you know, resolving intellectual difficulties, resolving emotional difficulties, and resolving, you know, emotional difficulties in terms of the conception of to the true, the good, and the beautiful, right? So I think we do have trouble with it resolving intellectual difficulties. I don't think logic studies are enough. I think they're really essential, but they're not enough on their own.
Yeah.
I think rhetoric has become so poisoned. People's emotional lives have become so poisoned by this whole thing that even rhetoric is maybe, you know, problematic. But the thing that's interesting about poetics is that Father Ashley says that rhetoric persuades, right? But poetics recreate.
Yeah.
And you know, recreation or recreation, right, of the soul of the person as a whole. I think that poetics is maybe how it has to be.
But
I don't, I
problem,
mean,
the poetic though is seen to be just particular idiosyncratic.
but it's not.
I know. So you have to somehow convey, like when people were watching Lord of the Rings in the theater when it came out, and they're just having this mystical, ecstatic experience.
Yeah.
Their longings are being
Yes.
evoked and fulfilled, and it's like, but then they leave. It's like, oh, that was a good movie. It's like, no, no, you just encountered reality.
No,
Okay.
I know, but I think that in the poetics, the longing, that's the recreation, right?
Yeah.
It's the reconnection to the real, but in a parallel way, such that the person doesn't quite realize that that's what happening. It sort of slips past, you know, their categories of thinking, their Leviathan category. It slips past into this deep longing, and I think that's what Saint Augustine was talking about when he said, you know, we long for God, and we will not stop longing until that hole is filled, and that hole can only be filled by God. And I think that good poetics can actually sort of reconnect that longing, reopen that wound, like in a sense, like maybe people need to be wounded.
Yeah.
They need those wounds reopened. They need to, you know, have their you know, buffered
Yeah,
cells
it's
sort of.
true. And the
And so
ultimate,
I don't know.
well, the greatest poetic artifact that we have is the liturgy, and the liturgy is the place
Mhm.
where the particular and the particular good, true, and beautiful, as incarnated in gestures, words, costumes, uh,
Yeah,
and movements, and architecture and
yeah,
incense and all that. I mean that that's
yeah. And
that's
I would,
that's where that's where it meets the
yeah.
universal, and of course that's why the enemies of God have attacked it so much. We know.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, if you read Aristotle's Poetics, and then you look at a high Tridentine Latin Mass, you'll see just how much of that,
Or the
is,
Byzantine liturgy too, of
or
course.
the Byzantine, yeah,
Yeah.
or
Well,
maybe the
that's
Coptic.
I think that's what Catherine Pickstock just said in her
Really?
book after writing the subtitle of her landmark book after writing is The Liturgical Consummation of Philosophy. And that's what she argues, that it really ends up, and she called Socrates a walking liturgy. Um,
Yeah, it makes total sense,
and
right?
I'll just leave our listeners
Yeah.
her recent, I'll put this in the show notes. Her recent lecture is magnificent. It's on the spider and the bee. And she just got inaugurated to a new post in England, some kind of divinity professor position. And she gave her inaugural lecture, and it's just absolutely stunning. And it really relates to all these themes on a super higher level because her IQ is like 400. So, but it's worth listening to. It's worth listening to.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Renee. We're at 80 minutes,
Okay.
81. So we will
Thank
see
you.
you next time. God
Okay.
bless you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
This has been Scandemic Resistance. I'm Thaddeus Kaczynski.